BioCentury This Week is brought to you by IQVIA Biotech. For biotech companies striving to bring innovative therapies to market and maximize patient impact, IQVIA Biotech is the trusted CRO of choice. Backed by 25 years of unparalleled experience and deep therapeutic expertise, our full-service clinical development solutions are purpose-built to accelerate success. IQVIA Biotech helps early-stage biotechs de-risk by developing strategic clinical development plans, guiding drug candidates along the most promising pathways. Leverage data-driven models and dynamic tools to craft a compelling value story, attract investment, and maintain momentum through every phase of drug development.
Treg cell therapies are nearing a clinical inflection point. What role might they play in the I&I treatment paradigm? Plus, searching for biotech's next big story, and Congress has finally passed the reconciliation bill. What are the good, bad, and missed opportunities for biotech? We'll discuss all of this on today's BioCentury This Week. I'm Stephen Hansen, one of the directors of Biopharma Intelligence here at BioCentury, and joining me are my colleagues
Simon Fishburne, Editor-in-Chief.
Karen Tkach-Tusman, Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
And Steve Usden, Washington Editor.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us. We're going to start with Karen, who's stepping in to chat about Lauren's upcoming story on Tregs. Now, I remember when the first companies were launched based on the development of Treg cell therapies for autoimmune indications. And, Karen, it seemed like a perfectly logical move. I mean, at the time, CAR Ts were really becoming established, in cancer. So it seemed like the really logical thing to modify an immune cell that was naturally immunosuppressive for autoimmune settings. Can you just kind of give us the background kind of on how the landscape has kind of shifted since then, and what are the challenges that Treg cell therapies now face?
So Tregs is a field, as a recovering immunology PhD, the Treg space has garnered much excitement, much consternation over the years. So as you alluded to, this is an immunosuppressive subtype of T cells that go around dampening the activity of other T cells and other immune cell subtypes. So this is a potentially great opportunity for autoimmunity. And people have been working on this for, I think, decades, going back to academic studies. And the first generations of this approach proved to not work out because unmodified Tregs, so you just isolate them and, try to put them in, grow them up, they're hard to work with, they're difficult to isolate and expand, and they didn't prove potent enough. But around 7 to 5 years ago, we saw this kind of new generation of companies launch to develop Tregs that were engineered, now with a CAR construct or a TCR construct, maybe some other modifications. And there was a lot of excitement around that. There were some large venture rounds back in the heyday of, 2021. But it's been a minute since we've seen that enthusiasm. And only now are we getting to a place where, as our colleague Lauren Martz puts it, there's going to be some clinical efficacy data reported this year, in particular from Quell Therapeutics. They have put a stake in the ground saying, yes, we're going to have some efficacy data. And there's also phase 1 studies ongoing from Sonoma and from Abada. So it's a place where we're finally maybe getting to that clinical inflection point.
So, Karen, autoimmunity is obviously a huge field. Cell therapies generally are still very onerous as a form of treatment. Where do you see this technology in terms of indications having its sort of nearest term impact?
Well, Lauren really nicely sets this up in terms of Tregs are now kind of breaking through maybe with some clinical efficacy data and what's happened with other cell therapies since. So specifically, as we all know, CAR T cells, effector CAR T cells for autoimmunity that deplete B cell compartments. There's been a lot of enthusiasm and promising data there. As well as, she points out, the islet transplant space has really shown some promising signs lately. And so there is now a sense that, well, maybe cell therapies are serious contenders for autoimmunity. But in a way, these approaches have kind of leapfrogged the Treg in terms of clinical momentum at the moment. And so what Lauren says very astutely is that in the face of evolving cell therapy competition, Tregs will need to find a niche to succeed. And it's exactly what you said. It comes down to indications. So speaking with folks in this space and doing her own analysis, it really seems like the best play for Tregs may be in complex autoimmune indications where depleting a single cell type like B cells just won't do it. And you need this kind of multi-pronged effector mechanism. And she walks through very nicely, as you'll see when the story comes out, the sort of at least 5 arms of how Tregs disable immune activation. And so in a way, what she positions it as is that where the existing approaches of depleting B cells won't cut it, where a simple islet replacement won't cut it, that's the place where Tregs have the most room to run.
Thanks, Karen. I mean, one of the things that I think about is the convergence of this technology developing and where we are in the biotech landscape, which, Stephen is going to talk a little bit more about that soon. But there's really seems to be a little bit of a shift away from platform companies. What you're talking about is a lot of platform technologies. And so I think the islet cell one is really interesting, but I'm sort of wondering to what degree these companies are under pressure to really be focusing in on a specific product rather than being able to develop their technologies. It's to some degree a funding question.
That is very fair. And I think, it is interesting to see where some of these first indications are, where I think they are taking a kind of focused approach. So Quell's first indication is in liver transplant rejection, and the target there for Tregs, and Lauren gets in very nicely to how the targeting strategy for Tregs is less about what to kill than where to go. But there it's around getting the Tregs to go to where the graft is, so where the donor tissue is. And that's something where she spoke with leadership from Quell, and they really set up why this product opportunity they think is so important in terms of the unmet need for these patients in the long term. And then Sonoma, their phase 1 is around, they're targeting citrullinated proteins, which are proteins that accumulate with a post-translational modification in both rheumatoid arthritis and hidradenitis suppurativa. So there it's the same product, 2 different indications. Looking at, the conversations that Lauren had, while there is some discussion of subsequent indications and opportunities, I would say they're kind of positioning it in a product style way, looking at those key early indications and why they think there's a good chance there.
Thanks, Karen. And just also I wanted to kind of make the point that the reason that you're joining us today is because Lauren is out on PTO. I believe she's sunning herself somewhere on the Jersey Shore, probably eating ice creams or something of that nature. So, yes, well-deserved time off for her.
I imagine she's actually kind of looking after kids rather than just tanning herself, and making sure that they are fully entertained and
SPF.
You can look after kids and eat ice cream and tan yourself at the same time. Those can all be multitasking.
We'll ask about the ice cream when she gets back, but yeah.
But Karen, one other thing was that you did mention obviously about that big funding boom, and now that we're just getting the clinical data now, can we explain what the lag is there? Why we're seeing the difference?
Sure. Well, cell therapies are always hard, and with Treg therapies in particular, and Lauren's story gets into it, there's challenges in terms of the cell type itself. It's less stable than effector T cells in terms of maintaining their identity as Tregs, and you have to really figure out how to culture them. One thing I thought was really interesting was around the idea that patient Tregs, manufacturing those was different than optimizing manufacturing for healthy donor Tregs. So in the autologous programs, that was something where you couldn't just take some healthy donor Tregs and assume the same process would apply to autologous patient Tregs. And that in the pandemic in particular, it's really hard to get autoimmunity patients who may be immunosuppressed to come out and donate some cells so they can, attempt these manufacturing innovations. And so It's one of those things where the cell type is more finicky than others. And I think the field's learned a lot in the last 4 years in terms of how to industrialize that product type.
Wonderful. Well, great. Well, thank you, Karen, for stepping into the breach. We appreciate it. Lauren's story will be out this week, so everyone can look out for that coming soon. We will take a quick break, and then we will be right back.
BioCentury This Week is brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds Europe. Grand Rounds, BioCentury's R&D conference, will make its European debut in 2025. Join us to debate key translational bottlenecks and unlock scientific breakthroughs with commercial potential. Connect with VCs, academic innovators, and biopharma R&D and BD leaders to explore cutting-edge advancements in early-stage R&D as we dive into disease biology, therapeutic modalities, and enabling technologies. Join us for the inaugural BioCentury Grand Rounds Europe in Cambridge, UK, the September 17th to 19th. Register and learn more at biocenturygrandroundseurope.com.
Welcome back to BioCentury This Week, and they have very temporarily even given me the reins to be able to welcome you all back, so I could go wild with this, but I won't. Instead, I'm going to turn the spotlight to you, Stephen. You are working on our 3Q preview, our quarterly preview, which is a little bit of a wrap up of the first half and a preview for what's coming, I guess. And, you know, I think that we all know there's headwinds still ahead on the public markets. Tell us some good news, Stephen. What is getting investors excited?
I wish I had some good news to share, Simone. And I should say, so this is for a perspective that we published last week, and I got a little carried away with my reliance on sort of the aviation analogy of headwinds and tailwinds. But, you know, I kind of figure might as well just carry that forward here. So in my conversations with investors, a lot of the time it was all about these headwinds that biotech is facing. So this is broader macro stuff like interest rates. It's also sector-specific stuff like MFN pricing proposals and FDA. And, you know, for all of these issues, there's varying degrees of concern about what needs to be resolved before biotech can begin to perform better. And obviously, this is all taken on very large generalities. Obviously, there's very specific things that companies can get done that can help their share prices. But generally, you know, most investor focus has been on all these things that are kind of holding the sector back. But something that kind of started to come up in the discussion was not only the stuff that's kind of the headwinds that biotech's facing, also what I guess kind of coalesced into sort of a lack of tailwinds for the sector as well. So when you think back to all of the good sort of bull markets that biotech has had, there's almost always been some sort of fairly simple story that the sector could either sell or sort of easily explain to kind of demonstrate their value to a broad swath of investors, which are sort of these fabled generalists that we always kind of talk about. So just to give you a couple of quick examples, obviously in 2020 with COVID, there was the sort of the real-time demonstration of biotech's ability to innovate, you know, by creating vaccines and therapies to combat the pandemic. In 2013, you had big growth drivers across sort of all of the mid and large cap players. So you had HCV at Gilead, you had the CF combination therapies at Vertex, you had PD-1 inhibitors launching the IO revolution. So you had all these sort of big kind of paradigm shifting ways in which we treat disease that I think at the time were pretty clearly easy kind of ways to pitch to investors that, you know, this was not only going to be a major benefit for patients, but these were also kind of major revenue growth opportunities. And I guess, you know, in talking to investors, you know, over the past couple months, I've been asking some of them sort of like, so what's that big story that biotech more generally can sell to investors right now? Like what is that kind of major growth story? And to be honest, I feel like a lot of people have really been kind of stumped by how they would go about answering that question. I mean, I think to me, the most obvious one is obesity, right? I mean, that seems to be the major area that everyone, you know, sort of in and outside of biotech is aware of the GLP-1s and the weight loss drugs. But I think the problem for investors is 97% of that value, of that market value, is tied up in two companies. That's Lilly and Novo, you know, meaning that there's a really, really small sort of opportunity for investors to get any biotech exposure to that market. And then obviously I want your guys' feedback if you have any other ideas of other areas that could be coming. But I was just thinking about other, sort of hyped up areas that people thought were going to be the next big thing, like Alzheimer's antibodies. They've so far been pretty big commercial failure.
So, Stephen, one thing that occurs to me is you had pointed out in your very nice perspective that there's actually a lot of really great innovation going on, that there really is a lot of progress being made. And so, it sort of raises the question, in fact, as to whether biotech is just not telling stories well, right? Maybe the communication, their ability to actually convey this is part of it. Or are we in an era of incrementalism and it's sort of hard to create a really good story for generalists out of incrementalism versus specialists who may actually understand the sort of value of that? How do you think about those options?
I think it can be both, right? Because I think a lot of biotech's history, and understandably so, I mean, it's just like scientific progress in and of itself. The majority of it are
incrementalism. I'm just saying that that it's hard to make a story for generalists out of it.
I think that's true. I think there's something to that. And I think there's also, it's when you have a nice big theme that you can build a story around, that's much easier than to pitch. When your story is much more technical and it's built around very specific targets or very specific indication or things, I think that can be harder to get a generalist to buy into. And again, as I laid out in the perspective, this is not by any means to say that there isn't a lot of innovation happening. I think there's a ton of innovation happening in the sector. It just doesn't coalesce very nicely, as you say, into a simple story that I think can be sold to a generalist investor. And then I think to layer on top of that is the fact that none of the work that biotech companies are doing is happening in a vacuum for these generalists, right? I mean, there is this massive movement of investment into AI that's happening. And then there are tech IPOs. And I think all of that stuff that's occupying probably 90% of a generalist's time and attention. And so you already have this very reduced amount of time to try and get their attention. And so if you don't have a simple, attractive story to sell them, I think that makes it very difficult to get them to want to say, oh yeah, this is a place that I need to be overweight and I need to have a lot of my money put in here. And so I think that's just the challenge that the sector's facing at the moment.
Just to round it off, Stephen, the other issue that's sort of inescapable is the size of biotech, right? And we're still, according to almost everybody we speak to, in I don't know if we want to call it a correction, but an era where we're correcting for the right number of companies. So many companies were created in that boom era of the pandemic, early pandemic, and leading up to that. Almost everybody we speak to thinks that there were too many companies, not 100%, but somewhere in the 90% of people we speak to think there were too many companies. And many people think that we're not yet done with the culling. And so, the question is sort of how many companies do the generalists have to support for this to really be vibrant? We could be a vibrant sector with fewer companies and, fewer stories to sell. I don't know.
No, I think you're right. And it's also, again, I think the sector generally is in a much healthier place now than it has for a long time, just given the size of the specialist investor base that the sector has. And the point being that I don't think biotech is reliant on generalists to survive or even to progress.
Right. Well, that's the issue. Right?
It is just that when you're talking about sort of what I think people perceive to be sort of like a next kind of leg up for the sector, where rather than sort of trading flat or down or underperforming relative to like tech, as has been the case for the past 4 years, if you want to return to a situation where biotech is outperforming, that's where you kind of need that incremental money, the generalist investor, to be coming into the sector. And that's where I think the challenge is really quite steep at the moment.
Stephen, I wonder if, because you mentioned AI as a sector that's sort of competing for attention with biotech. There's, of course, the biotech AI intersection where there's a lot of stories running around like that. I think everyone's got some kind of an AI story these days, but maybe and I don't know what this would be, but especially strong, compelling AI life sciences story could be that next big tail.
It could be. I mean, I think that's still quite a small niche part of the market, right? When I think especially on the public markets, I think there's an opportunity, sure, but we also probably need to see a bit more. I don't know if proof of concept is the right word to use there, but right to show that AI can actually demonstrably cause that same step change that we saw with, how we treated cancer patients with a PD-1 inhibitor, right? And the big change you saw there, can you demonstrate that AI has that ability to change the cost structure or the speed of development or the ability to find new targets that you otherwise wouldn't, right? I think we need to still kind of see that play out. At least that's my perception of maybe what needs to come there. I don't know, Karen, obviously I know, Karen, you're a bit deeper in this than I am in terms of where AI is in terms of deployment now. I don't know what your take would be on kind of where we stand on that.
I would agree that you need a kind of probably singular, clear step change demonstration.
Is there a DeepSeek moment where you can say, like, look, we've just done something with AI that previously we thought would be
Well, another way to look
difficult.
at it is to say, when the Human Genome Project was done, when they sequenced the first human genome, people thought that overnight it would change everything and magically we would have cures for a lot of diseases. We didn't. And when that didn't happen, there was an expression of disappointment and people thought that the whole thing had been overhyped and so on. But then if you take a perspective on it a few years later, you realize that it actually changed everything, right? So AI, I think that, another way to look at AI is it's like that. It's not like overnight because there have been these advances in AI that, it's be like flipping a switch and everything's going to change. But I think if you come back and look at things 5 years from now, you'll also say, look, we couldn't imagine all of the things that it has made possible, and the world has been irrevocably changed as a result of it, including pharmaceutical development.
I agree with that framing, but that type of driving things forward, I guess, isn't the kind of switch that gets generalists flooding in. So maybe that's the tension there. I'm
thinking from an investor perspective, you need to, if that's going to be a theme that you're going to invest on, you're going to want to see, well, what value is that generating? And so I think that's the thing that they maybe have yet to really dig into. Like obviously with with a company like NVIDIA, it's the fact that there are billions and billions and billions of dollars being invested to build these AI models and foundational models and things. And those are all being driven by NVIDIA's technology. And so what is the value output coming from AI in biotech that would attract an investor to say, well, I have to own X company or, Y company? And I'm not sure if we've seen that yet.
I would agree we have not.
Well, good. Well, I think we will now move on to Steve. Now, I know we just had the I think as everyone probably has been following the kind of the drama of getting the reconciliation bill in the U.S. Congress passed over the past few weeks. There were some elements in there that are of pertinent importance for the life sciences sector. Steve, maybe if we could start with what are the good things that were in the reconciliation bill for biotech?
Well, for biotech and for the pharmaceutical industry in general, I think there are three things that are on the kind of positive side of the ledger. Probably the most important one is one that's gotten very little attention, which is permanent restoration of the immediate tax deduction for domestic R&D expenses. The tax bill that was passed in the first Trump administration, one of the ways that it paid for it was by changing the tax law so that companies couldn't take an immediate deduction for R&D expenses and instead force them to amortize them over time. Now that's been reversed for domestic R&D expenses, not for R&D expenses that are overseas. So that's very important. That's a big benefit for, especially for biopharmaceutical companies. Second one, another tax provision, the restoration of the 100% bonus depreciation for qualified property that's placed in service after January 19, 2025, all the way through 2029. That's kind of a mouthful. But similarly to the first one, what it means is that companies are going to be able to depreciate some capital investments, and then that has been expanded to include manufacturing facilities through 2029. That's going to be a big stimulus for onshoring, for investing in domestic manufacturing, including for the pharmaceutical industry. Third thing, the orphan drug Medicare drug price negotiation program exemption has been broadened. Remember the original bill, and we've talked about this on the podcast, Congress said that in order to be exempt from the IRA's price negotiation provisions, a drug could only have a single orphan designation. It turns out that, of course, that a lot of orphan drug development is predicated on the ability to get multiple indications, multiple orphan indications for the same drug. This created an enormous disincentive for doing that. There were public examples of companies that dropped programs to develop orphan indications because they already had one orphan indication for their drug, and they didn't want to risk losing their exemption from the Medicare drug price negotiation program. That's really was devastating for patients who were expecting or hoping that those drugs were going to be developed for their indications. So the bill broadens the exemption to include drugs with orphan designations without any limit on the number of orphan indications that a drug has. The second thing, which is that if a non-orphan indication, if a drug gets a non-orphan indication, then it loses the exemption, but the time starts from the moment of the non-orphan indication approval. So 9 years for small molecules, 13 years for biologics, starts at the time when the first non-orphan indication is approved. That's important because there was some lack of clarity about how all that would work. It's been interesting to me to see the press coverage of the orphan drug provision in the law. The New York Times had a story which really just portrayed this as a giveaway to big pharma and, mentioned a $5 billion price tag that the Congressional Budget Office has said that this was going to cost. The Wall Street Journal had kind of the opposite story on their editorial page, saying this is a win for patients and for orphan drug development. Personally, on this one, I think it is a big win for patients. I think a lot of this was driven by patients or the rare disease community, which lobbied Congress very, very hard to get this exemption expanded.
What about the bad stuff, Steve?
There are several provisions in the law that are going to result in fewer Americans having coverage, healthcare coverage, and that's going to result in less spending on drugs. It's going to result in less access to drugs, and it's going to result, of course, in public health, a deterioration of public health, and in the health of individual patients. Medicaid funding cuts of estimated between $790 and $1 trillion over 10 years. That's going to reduce enrollment. That's going to lead to reduced drug access and spending. The Urban Institute estimates $184 billion in drug spending will be cut over a decade. I'm sure that there are estimates out there that are much smaller than that, but in any case, it's going to have an effect. Reduced premium support for the Affordable Care Act is another thing that's going to lead to people losing their insurance coverage. That's going to result in less drug sales. People don't have insurance coverage. They don't have access to drugs. A third thing, the Medicaid work requirements, they're projected to result in loss of coverage of 10 to 12 million people. They don't kick in until 2027. And there's some provisions in the law that allow states to get extensions that are going to delay the impacts. But over time, again, that's going to lead to fewer people having coverage. Fewer people having coverage means less access to drugs, means less spending on drugs.
Hey, Steve, what about missed opportunities? Talk about those.
So the biggest one for the biopharma industry is fixing the IRA pill penalty. That was in the House bill, and it was taken out as a result of President Trump's displeasure about the House removing most favored nation provisions related to Medicaid from the bill. That language that was taken out would have extended the Medicare drug price negotiation program's exemption for small molecule drugs to 13 years to match the exemption for biologics. The other big thing that was taken out, there were a whole variety of provisions that were discussed. Some of them were in the House bill. Some of them were intended to be in the House bill or in the Senate bill that would have reformed PBM business practices in ways that would have made them more transparent, that would have made it more difficult for PBMs to extract rebates from pharmaceutical companies, and would have lowered the incentives for PBMs to prefer more expensive drugs over less expensive drugs. Almost all the PBM reform provisions were stripped out of the bill.
Well, I'm sure that actually hurts a lot of people in pharma, in our industry. They often point to PBMs as an area that needs to have an element of scrutiny that it doesn't have. So I'm sure there's a lot of people going to be annoyed about that. Any sense on how industry representatives, biopharma, anybody else is sort of overall viewing net the changes in the legislation?
I think that the tax provisions are probably some champagne corks that are, popping over the tax provisions. On the other hand, it's not like they're a huge surprise. I think what happened is what people who were interested in this expected to have happen. Nonetheless, it's going to be quite beneficial, especially for the very largest pharmaceutical companies. I think that the pill penalty issue hasn't gone away. It's likely going to be part of whatever kind of deal is negotiated around President Trump's insistence on having some kind of most favored nation drug pricing policy in the United States. I think the PBM reform is a bigger issue. We're more likely to see substantial PBM reform as a result of litigation that happens across the United States over the next few years than as a result of legislation.
Great. Well, thank you, Steve, for that. I think we'll have something out this week as well on this, so you'll be looking out for that. Tune in to our sister podcast, The BioCentury Show, where the most recent episode features myself in conversation with Zealand President and CEO Adam Steensberg, discussing the opportunities for amylin agonists in obesity. If you like the show, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a comment or a review. You can find all of these stories at biocenturypodcast.com. Thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you next week. Kendall Square Orchestra provides the music for BioCentury this week. The group connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music while supporting causes related to healthcare and education.
BioCentury would like to thank IQVIA Biotech for supporting the BioCentury This Week podcast. To learn more about how IQVIA Biotech can help you turn your vision into venture capital, go to IQVIAbiotech.com/visionaries.